How's it going, everybody, and welcome to episode 256 of Master My Garden Podcast. Now, this week's episode, I think I mentioned last week, it's kind of a run through the top 10 podcasts of the year, and I suppose just a kind of an overview of the year in general and an overview of the podcast. And definitely on the wind down for Christmas now at this stage, so this will be the last kind of episode, and next week's one will just be a message of happy Christmas to all of you listeners. But this week's one is, yeah, it's interesting because I've kind of been doing this for the last couple of years. I look back on the most popular episodes of the year and a sort of a top 10 of most listened to since the podcast released. Now, this week's episode 256, it's a lot of episodes. They're typically, they range from 30 minutes up to, well, I suppose there's some small shorter than that, but they're typically on average kind of 40 minutes long and 256 of them. And it's quite a lot of hours of content. And it's interesting to see, I suppose, and it's important for me to see which episodes kind of continue to do well and resonate well. And then that allows me to kind of keep giving, producing content along those lines. And the monthly sewing guides are hugely popular. None of them actually fall into the top 10 as such, but they're all very, very high up there. So, and I know from the messages I get from people that clearly those episodes help people. And I kind of, at this time of the year, every year, kind of remind myself what the aim of the podcast is, and that is to help you guys in your own garden, however that might be. On a weekly basis, there kind of needs to be something that's useful or you can take away or interesting or something that you can use basically in your own garden. And that has been I suppose, since day one, that has been the kind of overriding theme of the podcast. But I like this episode, and I like kind of looking back over the last year. And in terms of, I was just looking to see this episode last year was actually, we chatted about how difficult of a year it was in terms of weather. And being perfectly honest, this year has been quite funny as well. And, we had that really, really, really cold and wet spring this year. And I suppose everything kicked off very late, and it's kind of similar to last year. It wasn't a perfect gardening year. Thing about it was, once you got into kind of June time, we didn't really get a wonderful summer. We got some little small snaps of great weather, but in general it was kind of an average summer here. And that in a way was quite good for gardening, even though there wasn't a wild amount of sunshine at any stage during the year. It was kind of decent enough all through the summer months. We didn't really get that long kind of droughty period this year that we've got used to over the last couple of years at certain stages. So another kind of challenging year on the weather front, but I don't know of any year that's kind of different to that. There's always some bit of a challenge, especially when you live, in Ireland. You're a small island on the edge of the Atlantic. You're going to be getting sort of turbulent weather. Whether it's any different, I guess it is. It seems to be different to what I remember as a child anyway. So yeah, it's definitely, weather is changing anyway. Um, but yeah, a challenging year, but a good enough year from my perspective. I mentioned, and I've been talking about it a bit. The last year in the garden has been a bit wishy-washy in that I haven't been able to dedicate the time to it that I would like, because of other commitments. And I suppose looking into next year, I'm going to have a little bit more time to, I suppose, invest in the garden, and that will help in terms of I suppose keeping you guys updated with what is going on and what's happening. Going into next year, I want to try and get a little bit more kind of a community element to the podcast. I don't post anywhere near enough on social media. I'm also looking at a way to kind of bring everything together into a community type situation where, we can all have a bit more interaction because, as I said on so many occasions, the podcast is funny because, and we'll go through it in a minute, there's people listening from everywhere, and the amount of listeners that I have is phenomenal. But the thing about it is, I actually don't know very, very many of you. I know from the messages when people reach out that, the podcast has helped, that it is helping, that they look forward to it, that it's entertaining, that it's, you know, allowing them to learn. It's People have mentioned it as being their starting point in gardening and so on. So I do get these messages on a regular basis, and they're always messages when somebody has achieved something or has done something or has started something, and it's off the back of something they learned on the podcast. And that's what it's all about. But I'd like to kind of have a little bit more community element to it. So that's something that I really want to work towards next year, along with the courses, which, I did a kind of a soft launch on those in the year gone out. But I'd like to kind of do that, ramp that up a little bit more and tie in a community element to it going into next year. But anyway, that's all for the future and for the coming weeks. So for this week, as I say, I wanted to talk about the top episodes. And I'm going to run down and I'm going to start it at number 11 rather than it being a top 10. I'll tell you why. It'll become obvious when we get about halfway through the list. But at number 11, it's episode 144, and it's garden design tips with Jane McCorkle. And that was it's a really interesting episode that, from memory, it was very, very practical in terms of garden design tips. So Jane, I probably should have listened back to it before I sort of started this one, but Jane gave very good tips on what you need to come up with in your own sort of idea and your head before you speak to a garden designer, and then she gave good tips for how you would go about, what's a must have in the garden and what's the sort of the template that you would use to create a good garden design. She spoke about her own gardening style, and there was some really great tips in it. And it was a very, very good episode, and it's one that has grown massively this year. And as I say, it's in at number 11, effectively number 10. And I'll tell you why, as I say, when we get up along the list. At number 10, which is episode 132, that was a brilliant episode with June Blake. So June Blake, plant combinations and brilliant colors. So for anyone who has visited June Blake's garden in County Wicklow, it is a phenomenal garden. And June would be kind of best known for her use of really bright and vivid and bold colors. And she speaks a lot in that episode about plant combinations and how to use those plant combinations to create brilliant color borders. Hot borders, I know, was a topic. Hot colored borders was a topic of conversation during the episode. But a fantastic garden, and June is a really brilliant, brilliant gardener. But that episode is new to the top 10, I think, and a really, really good one. Delighted with the next one. So episode 139 is one of my own episodes, and I like I like when my own episodes are in the top 10, because it means, that they're what the content is in it is resonating with people. And it's episode 139. It's the top 10 perennials to sow in the autumn time. And, we speak about that on the podcast a lot, that the autumn time is a great time to create plants for virtually free, just by sowing a few seeds. You can create so many perennial plants. And it went through a list of the top 10. And I know, not initially, but sometime later, I would have got quite a few pictures from people or messages from people where they followed the steps, followed the recommendation, and sowed these. And now, at that point when they messaged, 7, 8, 9 months later, they had these fantastic perennial plants grown from seed, and it created better plants. I know one of the messages was that the plants were more resilient because they had been grown there with their own love and attention, but also better flowering, stronger plants. And that's exactly what the aim of that episode is. So episode 139, 10 perennial plants to sow this autumn. Just myself, I was delighted with that one to be in there in number 9. Number 8 on the list is one that was there last year, and it's Tangai from Dunmore Country School. Dunmore Country School in Durrow, County Laois, and they teach gardening courses, homestead courses, beekeeping courses, and so on. And Tangai came on the podcast, episode 59 and 60. It was actually a two-part episode, and I remember saying this last year, that they were 2 episodes on companion planting, and they were absolutely superb. Episode 59 continues to perform massively well, is number 8 on the list. And episode 61, which was the follow-on to that, is way down the list. And it just doesn't make sense because they're actually quite heavily linked. But 59 is a phenomenal episode, really, really good episode. And 60, as the follow-on to that, is brilliant as well. But for some reason, it doesn't kind of get the same level of listens. But 59 is a phenomenal episode. So much good tips in it on companion planting, on, I suppose, fertilizing the soil, no dig, but a different take on no dig. Lots of growing tips, lots of tips on companion plants, a different take on companion planting. And yeah, a really brilliant episode from probably one of the best gardeners in the country. Number 7 on the list is episode 39, a very old episode, and it's with one of the best known organic vegetable growers in the country is Klaus Leitenberger, and Klaus is brilliant at all things growing. He has grown and been the head gardener in a lot of estates around the country. I know that he's moved recently to a new garden of his own up in, I think, County Mayo or County Sligo, up that neck of the woods, and looking forward to seeing what he does there. But he teaches courses, he lectures, he's often at, different speaking events, and would be I suppose, one of the most prominent organic growers in the country. And his books I referenced last week on the podcast are phenomenally good. Vegetables for an Irish Garden, the Irish Vegetable Handbook, and Fruit and Vegetables for the Polytunnel or Greenhouse. Brilliant books, and ones that are brilliant to dip in and out of. And that's episode 39, and it's number 7 on the list. The next one on the list has been basically tracking in the top 10 for the last 2 years. A superb episode, Dr. Elaine Ingham from the Soil Food Web. She talks all about the intricacies of healthy soil, how to create healthy soil, what is actually happening in that amazing world of soil. We've all heard the phrase that there's more life in a teaspoon of healthy soil than there is people on the planet, and or more organisms than there is people on the planet. And that's phenomenal. The more you think about that, 1 teaspoon, there is more living organisms in that teaspoon of healthy soil than there is people on the planet. Now, I don't know how many people's on the planet, but there's a lot. And when you look at that versus a teaspoon of soil, and consider that each one of them has a function, has a role within that teaspoon of soil, that teaspoon of healthy soil, then you start to get I suppose, the intricacies, as I say, of the soil food web. And Dr. Lane explains it in a brilliant way, a way that's simple to understand and a way that makes sense. And as I say, she speaks with amazing authority on it and knows it inside out. So that's episode 125, and it's number 6 on the list. Now, the reason I have 11 on the list in total is because number 5 on the list is the very first episode of Master My Garden podcast. And for some reason, that has shot up this year to number 5 on the list. It's Master My Garden Introduction. Everyone says that when you record something, whether it's a YouTube video, and you continue doing it for a period of time, whether it's a podcast and you're doing it for a period of time, and eventually at some point in time, you look back on the very first one that you published, and most people get embarrassed, and I suppose, yeah, they're not overly happy with that as a piece of content to go out. Having said that, from my point of view, I don't have the sense of embarrassment in it. I'm surprised actually that it's up here at number 5. I don't know why, but it has just been phenomenal this year, that one, for some reason. It's up to number 5. It's it's an episode where from any of you that have been listening since the start of the podcast, when I started this podcast, I had no tech skills. Actually, still probably don't. I had never had a social media account of any sort. I definitely didn't know anything about how to record a podcast. I don't understand speakers and different types of audio file, and I still don't understand much about it. But the one thing about it was that the message was that the aim of the podcast was to help you in your garden. And I suppose I'm glad that that still rings true, that that's still the aim of it, that that's still the purpose of the podcast. I don't understand why it's after shooting up to number 5, but I listen back, not necessarily with a sense of embarrassment, but I can really remember when I listen back to that how nervous I was because, as I say, I really stepped outside my comfort zone in recording those first episodes. I was a bag of nerves sitting in a room with just me, and I felt really jittery. Now, obviously, as time goes on, you sort of lose that a little bit and you become way more comfortable. I still probably say and am too many times, but at the same time, I'd be a lot more comfortable now. And listening back to that, I can actually hear the nervousness as I spoke. But as I say, the reasoning and the idea behind the podcast hasn't changed, and it's good every now and again to hear that and to, I suppose, reassure myself that the the aim hasn't changed, that the alignment is still there with the original purpose. And yeah, as I say, I'm surprised it's up there now in the top 10, but kind of happy that it is as well, because at least it means that more people are hearing that that is the message, that is the aim of the podcast. So that's why I have 11 on the list, because I kind of not really counting that one. It was only an introduction. It doesn't, it doesn't go into anything gardening specific in that episode. And for that reason, I've put 11 on the list and I'm not really including that one. But nonetheless, that's where it is, number 5 on the list. Number 4 on the list was another brilliant episode, episode 130, with Niall McCauley from the YouTube channel Niall Gardens. Now, Niall has, since he was on the podcast, has gone on to become the newcomer of the year, the Alan Titchmarsh Award in the Garden Media Guild. I think that was either I think it was 2022 or, yeah, I think it was 2022. And that was, fantastic achievement to get that. Niall is brilliant. His YouTube channel is brilliant. And that episode was particularly good. It was just a very good conversation, gardening conversation, and went in many directions. But Niall, as I say, a really good, nice guy. YouTube channel is really good and has been growing phenomenally well, and I know has a huge audience. And yeah, since then has gone on to win that brilliant award and is doing great things. So I can understand that episode being number 4. Yeah, really, really popular episode. The next episode has shot right up to number 3, and again, it's one I'm kind of surprised at. And most of it is actually coming from, it's episode 75, how to grow lavender successfully in Ireland. And it was with Moira Hart, who's Wexford Lavender Farm, and it was a really good episode, just chatting about lavender and nothing else. And it continues to be really, really successful. And I think that's because lavender is something that loads of people love it, loads of people grow it, but loads of people have failures with it. Mostly down to the varieties, sometimes down to the fact that they're in a bad spot for lavender. But that episode really highlights, what you need to do to get it right. And I wrote a blog post on it, which is not something I do very often, but I do have a blog post on it, and that's actually where the majority of the traffic is coming for this episode. So in the episode, I embed the podcast player, and that specific episode is there. So you read your blog post on how to grow lavender successfully, and at the very bottom then the podcast is there. So that is something that obviously people are searching for, trying to get the answer to, and then they're coming across the blog post and able to click through to listen from that. And yeah, surprised, very surprised at that one being number 3, but it is, and it's the first time that it has come up into the top 10. The next two haven't changed. They've been number 1 and number 2 since the start. Number 2 is episode 26, a very, very early episode. It was in July of that first year when I started, and it was with Sandra Cafolla, all about growing wildflowers. And that episode continues to be the second most popular episode of the podcast. It's also, I suppose, the one that I get the most messages about, because so many people want to and are interested in growing wildflowers, and lots of people have messaged, and always the theme is that episode just cuts through all the jargon and gets really to how you can sow a wildflower meadow. And the reason that is because Sandra is without a doubt the authority on growing wildflowers, native wildflowers in Ireland. And that's why that episode continues to be so popular. It cuts through all of that. If you have any questions on it, it answers everything in a brilliant way. And it's, Sandra's fun, and he understands wildflowers. He understands how to grow them, what will work, what won't work, and so on. And that course that I've created with Sandro, so it's an online course that answers all of those questions and gives all the practical of how to actually sow and be successful with a meadow, and everything from the seed to sowing to aftercare to the frequently asked questions. And it's, that's a brilliant course, and it's a brilliant episode. So that's episode 26, and that's number 2 on the list. Number 1 on the list is the same number 1 that it was last year and the year before. And it's kind of no surprise, the sensation that is, no dig sensation that is Charles Dowding. Early enough episode 56, and Charles was on the podcast. Obviously, he has, huge following online, and the episode just basically talks about no dig gardening, the benefits of it. That's something that on the podcast I've spoke about a lot since, how I've started to use that method more or less since then, and talks about the successes of it, what makes it work, and Charles answers kind of all the questions. It dispels some myths about, growing that people kind of have got used to hearing, and it really, again, cuts through all the kind of stuff that, people wonder about, and a lot of things that we're told to be true, and some of those, as I say, myths are kind of busted in that episode. And it's just a brilliant chat. He's a really, really good guy. Obviously everyone knows him online, but yeah, he's brilliant, and the episode was very, very good. And yeah, so that's the top 10. So to just run through them again, number 11 was episode 144, Garden Design Tips with Jane McCorkle. Number 10 was episode 132 with June Blake. That was Plant Combinations and Brilliant Colours. Number 9 was episode 139, 10 Perennials to Sow This Autumn with yours truly. Number 8 was episode 59 of Tangai from Dunmore Country School, all about companion planting. Episode 39 was number 7, and that was Klaus Leitenberger talking about growing organic fruits and vegetables. Number 6 was Dr. Elaine Ingham from the Soil Food Web, all about soil health and understanding that. Number 5 was the introduction, episode 1 of Master My Garden podcast, all the way back from, I think, February 2020. Number 4 was episode 130 with Niall McCauley from Niall Gardens. Number 3 was episode 75, How to Grow Lavender Successfully in Ireland. Number 2 was episode 26 with Sandra Cafolla. And number 1 for the 3rd year running was Charles Dowding's episode 56. I don't think that number 1 spot or number 2 spot are going to change next year. Just looking at the numbers, they're certainly being challenged. As I said, the top 10 is definitely going to change, because there's a lot of great episodes that are just outside the top 10 that are doing really well. A lot of the seed sowing guides are right up there with big numbers, and they kind of continue as the period of time. So if it's a March sowing guide, the March sowing guide, once March comes around again, that one seems to pop up and get onto people's radar again. And yeah, they're really popular. Then there's episode with Jeff Lowenfels again on soil health. That's a must listen to if anyone is interested in that. I forget what number it is, but it's there somewhere. And there's so many other good episodes that are really tracking high now, and I think will push into the top 10 for next year. So it's nice, as I said, to look back on these and to see which ones are working well, which ones, which type of episode is worth continuing with, which, you know, what avenue or what topics you guys are liking, and it's obvious from that the type of episode that you do like. A lot of the how-to type ones, a lot of the ones with good information in it, the top 10 plants, perennials, that type of thing, they're all doing well. So that's along the lines of what we'll keep delivering to you. Some other interesting things at this time of the year to look on are the listening stats and so on. I don't look at them very often. They're not wildly important to me. Once I know that, people are listening, people are getting benefit. But I love looking at it at this time of the year to just kind of look at it and see, you know, what has changed or if anything has changed. And when you look at it this year, in the year 2024, Master My Garden podcast has been listened to in 27 countries. That is mind blowing. Now, some of the listens, when you get down the list, they're not always big numbers, so it's not huge. The biggest listenership is and continues to be obviously Ireland. The podcast is, I'm Irish based. It tends to be based more or less around the Irish garden, talking about what would be topical in our gardens, in my garden, and so it resonates, I guess, most with an Irish audience. But I have a huge listenership in the US and the UK, and the biggest growth one over the last 12 months has been Australia. France and Australia. France has been there for the last number of years, so a lot of listeners in France, a lot of listeners in Australia, United States, United Kingdom, Ireland, and so on. But 27 countries in total. 90% of you guys are listening to the podcast on mobile. And there's been a big shift this year. Last year it was kind of 50-50 Apple to Spotify. This year it's quite a big shift actually. Apple probably 60-40 now to Spotify. Slightly more than that actually, but yeah, thereabouts. And it's nearly all mobile, as I say, 90% mobile. So people are listening when they're out potting, when they're out weeding, when they're out pottering in their garden, when they're in their polytunnels. And it tends to be, I get a lot of messages of people that they're out doing some gardening chore or other and they're listening as they're doing that. So yeah, it's lovely to hear that, and lovely to hear those stories of where you're listening and so on. But I'll stick on my glasses now and just run through some of the cities. So it kind of goes into there's 27 countries, and I have listeners in Dublin, Cork, Galway, Limerick, Killarney, Sydney, Carlow, Kilkenny, Waterford, Letterkenny, Sligo, Tuam, Castlebar, Belfast, Navan, British Columbia, Tullamore, Chicago, Melbourne, West Sussex, Malahide, Naas, Carrick-on-Shannon, Wicklow, Kilmachannig, Ennis, San Jose, Tacoma, Washington, Boardman, Oregon, Dundalk, Lewisham. Some of these places I have no idea where they are. There's one there called Grosupplje. Not even sure how to pronounce it, but there's somebody listening there, and whoever you are, I'm delighted to have you. Leon, Mullingar, Banbridge, Wellington Region, Tower Hamlets, South Carolina, Drogheda, Hampshire, East Sussex, Dungarvan, Oslo, Great to hear people from Oslo, Portlaoise, Burr, Mallow, Tubbercurry, Denver, Colorado, Newport, New Mexico, Kent, Washington, New Orleans, Tasmania, Dudley, Wiltshire, Shropshire, Hampshire, Kentucky, Dunshaughlin, Cavan, London, Frankfurt, Lower Saxony, Stockholm, Ballymena, Listowel, Gurt, Buncrana, Monasterevin, Tullow, Castleisland, Bristol, Newry, Monaghan, Virginia, North Carolina again, Rhode Island, Glasgow, Banbridge, Milton Keyes, Virginia, Cornwall, Massachusetts, Clondalkin, Hull, Longford, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Tipperary, Ljubljana, Enfield, Cardiff, New York. It's brilliant. And this list goes right all the way down. I'm not going to name them all out, but there's some Texas, Arkansas, Missouri, Connecticut, Kent, Minnesota, Barnsley. It's brilliant. I love reading that list. I love reading that list. Now, as you go down further, there's a handful of listens in some of these places, but the majority of the ones that I called out there, they're regular listeners. So they're people who are listening on a very regular basis, and wherever you're listening, really appreciate it. Absolutely delighted to have you. Hopefully next year, as I say, we'll be able to connect a bit more. I'll be able to get to know you a bit better, and vice versa, and we might be able to add a little bit more of a community element to it. But regardless of what's to come for the last 12 months, really, really appreciate you listening. Really appreciate anybody that shared the podcast, anybody that, you know, sponsors me on Buy Me a Coffee, anyone that sends me messages on Instagram, Facebook, emails, anyone that does anything to support or promote the podcast. I really, really appreciate you. I hope you've had a great gardening year. I hope the podcast has helped you. Again, that's the aim of it. If there's ever a time where there's anything that you want me to cover, just let me know. If there's ever a time where you feel something needs to change or something needs to be better, by all means, I'm open to that. As I said, the aim has been and is always to help people in their own gardens, and hopefully the podcast continues to do that. To all you who are listening in all these places all over the world, I hope you have, a brilliant, brilliant Christmas. It's been a pleasure to be in your earbuds, to be in your gardens, to be with you while you're doing these chores. I hope that, yeah, as I say, you get something from the episodes. And I know for me, I love this episode at the end of the year, looking back on all of the ones that have been, the top episodes of the year, and particularly looking on people, looking like, obviously I can't see who you are. The stats just gives you a region that is listened to, and that comes through the podcast, stats. And but to know that there's people has listened in the last year in 27 countries in all those places that I've named out, plus equally as many again, and you're all listening while gardening, while doing your bits and pieces in the garden. That's really heartening, and really, really, as I say, appreciate it. And yeah, long may it continue. So yeah, that's this week's episode. It's pretty much the last gardening type episode of the year. Next week will be just a simple message of Happy Christmas to you guys, and then the podcast won't be back until the second Friday of January. I'm not sure. I think that's like 10th. So the podcast will be back that week, and back with a bang with regular weekly episodes at that point in time. But this is the last Friday until the 10th, and next week there'll be just a simple message of Happy Christmas to you guys. So that's been this week's episode. Thanks again for listening. Thanks again for listening all year. Thanks for your support. Thanks for your shares, your follows, your likes, anything that you do to promote the podcast. If you don't follow me on any of those social channels, on Instagram or anywhere like that, I don't post nearly enough, but I plan to change that next year. But please do give me a follow on Instagram. on Facebook, on YouTube. The podcast is on YouTube every week as well. So any of those places, give me a follow, share it, help it get out there, help it spread. Thank you so much for where you're listening from. Hope you have a great Christmas. And that's all from this week's episode. Thanks for listening. And until the next time, happy gardening.